In the autumn of 1863, a vineyard owner in the south of France noticed something wrong with his oldest vines. The leaves still looked green. The grapes still ripened on schedule. But underground, in soil nobody could see, the roots were quietly dying. Within a few years, that same invisible collapse spread across entire regions of French wine country, and nobody could explain why. What killed those vines turned out to be tied to something far larger than one bad harvest. A chain running through empire, religion, disease, and fraud, straight into the fruit sitting in your kitchen right now. This is the history of the grape, and it is far stranger than a fruit has any right to be. Comment the last wine or grape you tasted, because by the end of this video, you will never look at either one the same way again. Long before anyone thought to explain that dying vineyard, the grape was already doing something no other fruit could quite manage. Wild grapevines first grew across the Caucasus region, the stretch of mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian, sometime around 8,000 years ago. Archaeologists working in a cave in modern Armenia uncovered a complete ancient winemaking operation, crushed grape seeds, a stone basin, and pottery still stained from fermentation, dated to roughly 4,000 years before the Common Era. That discovery answered a question people had been guessing at for a long time. Humans were not just eating grapes. They had already figured out how to turn them into something else entirely. Here is the detail almost nobody knows, and it explains everything that follows. Grape skins carry wild yeast naturally, floating on the surface of every ripe berry in the world, waiting for the right conditions. Crush a grape, leave the juice sitting in a warm container, and that yeast will start converting sugar into alcohol on its own, without a single ingredient added by human hands. No other common fruit does this quite so easily or so reliably. Apples ferment, berries ferment, but grapes carry enough natural sugar and enough wild yeast riding on their skins that fermentation almost happens by accident. Early humans didn't invent wine. They discovered it, sitting in a forgotten jar, and once they tasted what fermentation produced, they never stopped chasing it again. Built into that one biological quirk was a complete transformation of the fruit's value. Fresh grapes spoil within days, but wine, once fermented, could last for years, travel for months, and survive conditions that would rot almost any other food source on Earth. In a world without refrigeration, without reliable food storage of any kind, that fact turned grapes into something closer to currency than produce. A jar of wine could be taxed. It could be stored through a famine. It could be carried across a desert in a way a basket of fresh fruit never could. The earliest civilizations noticed this immediately, and they built entire systems of power around it. Consider what that actually meant for a farmer 6,000 years ago. A field of wheat had to be threshed, ground, and baked almost immediately, or it attracted pests and rot within weeks. A crop of grapes could instead be crushed once, sealed inside a clay vessel, and left to transform into something that improved with time instead of decaying. That difference turned grape farmers into some of the earliest people in history capable of storing real, tradable wealth in liquid form, wealth that didn't rot in a granary or wash away in a flood. In ancient Sumer and Egypt, wine wasn't a casual drink available to everyone. Reserved almost completely for temples, priests, and rulers, it marked status in ways grain never could. Egyptian tomb paintings show detailed winemaking scenes, workers treading grapes by foot inside stone vats, jars sealed and labeled with the exact vineyard, vintage year, and quality grade, a labeling system that predates modern wine bottling by roughly 4,000 years. Ordinary Egyptian workers drank beer made from bread and grain. Wine belonged to a different tier altogether, a marker of power stamped directly onto a clay jar. Tomb inventories discovered by archaeologists list wine jars alongside gold and jewelry, valued possessions meant to accompany a ruler into the afterlife rather than simply refreshment for the living. But that was only the beginning. A fruit that could be preserved, taxed, and reserved for the powerful was never going to stay confined to one region of the ancient world. It was about to become one of the most valuable cargo items on Earth, and the empires that controlled it were about to discover exactly how much power a vine could carry. Sailing the Mediterranean roughly 3,000 years ago as history's first great maritime traders, the Phoenicians carried grapevines along their shipping routes the same way they carried purple dye and cedar wood, treating cuttings as valuable cargo worth the space below decks. Everywhere Phoenician ships landed, from the coast of modern Lebanon to the shores of Spain and North Africa, vineyards eventually followed. Wine wasn't just a product they sold. It was a technology they exported deliberately, port by port, along with the knowledge of how to grow and ferment. Once a technology this valuable starts spreading, it stops belonging to any one group of people. Wine became something entire civilizations would fight to control, refine, and eventually weaponize as a marker of who belonged to the civilized world and who did not. Sharpest of all those dividing lines was the one drawn across the ancient Mediterranean world. Ancient Greek writers openly described wine drinking as proof of civilization itself, contrasting their own vineyards against what they saw as rougher beer-drinking cultures to the north. Greek city-states built elaborate wine-mixing rituals into their social and political life, diluting wine with water at structured gatherings called symposia, where philosophy, politics, and power were debated over carefully rationed cups. Drinking wine undiluted, without ritual, was considered a sign of barbarism. The fruit had become a cultural boundary, separating those the Greeks considered refined from everyone else. Rome inherited that boundary and turned it into an instrument of empire. As Roman legions pushed into Gaul, Iberia, and beyond, colonial administrators planted vineyards deliberately across newly conquered territory, not simply for taste, but as a tool of cultural conquest. A region that grew Roman grapevines, drank Roman wine, and adopted Roman drinking customs was a region being absorbed into Roman identity, whether the local population realized it or not. Roman soldiers received wine as part of their standard rations, watered down and rationed carefully to keep armies functional on long campaigns far from home. Wine financed logistics. It rewarded loyalty. It marked territory as completely as any road or fortress Rome ever built. And this is where the story turns towards something almost nobody connects to a bottle of wine today. As the Roman Empire crumbled across the 5th century, most organized industries collapsed along with it. Roads fell into disrepair, trade routes disappeared, entire crafts were lost for centuries. Viticulture should have died the same way. It didn't, and the reason it survived says something remarkable about how deeply this fruit had already been woven into religious life. Christianity had placed wine squarely at the center of its central ritual, the Eucharist, where it stood in for the blood of Christ during Massachusetts. That theological requirement meant the Catholic Church needed a reliable, uninterrupted wine supply for every church across a collapsing continent. Forever, monasteries took on that responsibility, and monks became Europe's most disciplined and knowledgeable vintners for the better part of 1,000 years, carefully preserving grape varieties, documenting soil conditions, and refining fermentation techniques, while almost every other Roman-era skill disappeared around them. Benedictine and later Cistercian monks kept meticulous written records comparing how different plots of land, sometimes separated by only a few hundred feet, produced noticeably different wine, an early form of the terroir concept still used to market wine today. Entire regions of France and Germany owe their modern wine identity to monastic vineyards planted and protected precisely to keep churches supplied through centuries most people call the Dark Ages. Meanwhile, a different religious force was reshaping the fruit's economy on the other side of the Mediterranean. As Islam spread rapidly across the 7th and 8th centuries, its prohibition on alcohol didn't eliminate grape cultivation in newly converted regions. It redirected it. Farmers across the Middle East and North Africa kept growing grapes at enormous scale, shifting production toward fresh table fruit, syrups, and dried raisins instead of wine. Persian and Arab scholars during this same period documented advanced drying and preservation techniques for raisins, turning a perishable fruit into a stable, shippable good that could travel along the same overland trade routes once used to move wine. The same plant, the exact same biological organism, took two completely different economic paths depending on which empire and which religion controlled the land it grew on. A fruit's fate, it turned out, had almost nothing to do with the fruit itself and everything to do with the power structure standing over it. Across centuries, that pattern quietly shaped economies on two continents, until European ships began crossing the Atlantic and carrying grapevines somewhere they had never grown before. Spanish missionaries planted vineyards across the Americas starting in the 16th century, using wine for the same sacramental purpose that had kept European monasteries in business for 1,000 years. Grapevines followed colonization patterns almost precisely, appearing wherever European power planted a flag, from Mexico to Peru to what would eventually become California. By the 19th century, grape cultivation stretched across 4 continents, financing churches, taxing empires, and marking status from Roman villas to French royal courts. It looked, from the outside, like an industry that had already survived everything history could throw at it. It had not, because somewhere in that same century, ships crossing the Atlantic in the opposite direction were about to carry something back into Europe that nobody had accounted for. Something small enough to hide inside the soil of a potted vine, and powerful enough to bring the entire European wine industry to its knees within a generation. Arriving quietly, hidden in the roots of American vine cuttings shipped to European botanists eager to study New World grape varieties during the 1850s and 1860s, the threat gave no warning. Nobody inspected the soil closely enough. Nobody was looking for an insect smaller than a grain of rice, because nobody yet knew knew that insect existed. Its name was phylloxera, a microscopic aphid that fed exclusively on grapevine roots, and it had evolved for millions of years alongside American grape species that had built up natural resistance to it. European wine grapes, the species called Vitis vinifera, had never encountered this pest before, and they had no defense against it whatsoever. This is where the story returns to that vineyard owner from the opening scene. His vines looked perfectly healthy above the soil right up until the moment they died, because phylloxera worked completely underground, feeding on root systems while the visible plant kept functioning normally for months, sometimes years, before finally collapsing all at once. By the time French vintners understood what they were looking at, the infestation had already spread across multiple wine regions, invisible, unstoppable, and completely undiagnosed. A French botanist named Jules-Émile Planchon spent years digging up dying vines by hand, examining root after root under a magnifying glass, before finally identifying the tiny insect responsible in the late 1860s, a discovery that came only after entire valleys had already gone silent. What happened next devastated an entire nation's identity. Over roughly 15 years, phylloxera destroyed an estimated 2/3 of French vineyards, wiping out family estates that had produced wine for centuries, collapsing regional economies that depended on export revenue, and triggering a genuine national crisis debated in the French Parliament itself. The French government reportedly offered a substantial cash prize to anyone who could find a cure, and hundreds of proposed remedies flooded in, from flooding vineyards to drown the insect, to burying toads under vine roots as folk superstition, none of which solved the underlying problem. Entire villages built around winemaking emptied out as families lost their only source of income in a matter of seasons. Some historians argue the phylloxera crisis reshaped rural French migration patterns for the following 50 years, pushing displaced wine families toward cities and, in some confirmed cases, toward immigration overseas. A tiny insect had done more damage to the French countryside than most invading armies ever managed. The solution, when it finally arrived, revealed something almost nobody expected. An American entomologist named Charles Valentine Riley had already been studying phylloxera on native soil back in Missouri, and he corresponded with French researchers, proposing an idea many traditionalists in France found almost offensive at first: grafting precious, centuries-old French vines onto the very same American rootstock that had unknowingly caused the disaster. Prominent winemakers resisted furiously, insisting that grafting foreign roots beneath sacred French soil would corrupt the character of their wine forever, that the terroir itself would be tainted by association with the plant that had nearly destroyed them. Faced with total collapse, they eventually had no other option left to try. French and American scientists, working somewhat independently and racing against a collapsing industry, confirmed that grafting European grape varieties onto resistant American rootstock could save the vines wholesale. The fruit-bearing top half of the plant stayed authentically European, producing the exact same grape variety that had grown in that region for generations. But the root system underneath, the actual living infrastructure keeping the plant alive, became something fully different, a species that had evolved on another continent altogether, permanently and irreversibly. That detail changed everything. Vineyard owners across France began mass grafting programs, importing American rootstock by the shipload and splicing centuries-old European grape varieties onto foreign roots just to keep their industry alive at all. It worked. Wine production gradually recovered across the following decades, but it recovered as something structurally different than what had existed before the crisis. And the very traditionalists who once called grafting a corruption of French identity eventually had no choice but to depend on it completely. Here is what almost no wine drinker on earth realizes today. Nearly every wine grape grown anywhere in the world right now, including the most prestigious, tradition-bound vineyards in Bordeaux and Burgundy, grows on American rootstock grafted decades or centuries ago and continuously propagated ever since. The grapes themselves, the fruit going into your glass, remain genetically identical to varieties cultivated for 1,000 years. But underground, invisible to anyone holding a bottle, sits a root system descended from the very continent that had accidentally caused the disaster in the first place. The same global trade network that spread this crisis across an ocean is the exact same network that saved the industry from total collapse. Nothing about that irony ever makes it onto a wine label. Underneath a global industry that today generates well over $300 billion a year, that hidden graft sits in the soil of almost every vineyard on the planet, and the pattern from thousands of years ago never actually disappeared. It just changed shape, status, control, and fraud still define this fruit the way they did in ancient Egypt. Modern wine regions operate under strict legal classification systems, appellation laws that dictate precisely which grapes can be grown where, and under what conditions a bottle is even legally allowed to use a prestigious regional name. Break those rules, and a bottle can be seized, relabeled, or destroyed by regulators, the same way status once separated Egyptian temple wine from ordinary grain beer. The line has simply moved from temple walls to legal paperwork. Wine's extraordinary value has also made it one of the most actively counterfeited luxury products on earth. Rare vintage bottles have sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Prices high enough that entire criminal operations have built careers forging labels, refilling empty bottles with cheaper wine, and selling fabricated vintages to collectors who rarely open what they buy. One infamous case in the early 2010s saw a person convicted of manufacturing and selling millions of dollars in counterfeit rare wines from what was essentially a home laboratory, blending cheaper vintages and aging techniques to imitate legendary bottles decades old, some supposedly sourced from cellars that investigators later proved never existed. Auction houses now employ specialists whose entire job is authenticating old bottles, checking glass composition, cork aging, and label paper against known originals, an entire forensic industry built around a fruit that once simply spoiled within a week of being picked. The fruit that once separated pharaohs from field workers now separates genuine multi-million-dollar collections from elaborate fakes sitting in the exact same climate-controlled cellars. Meanwhile, that original hidden mechanism, natural fermentation itself, eventually became something humans learned to deliberately switch off rather than harness. During the temperance movement of the late 19th century, an American dentist named Thomas Welch developed a pasteurization process precisely to stop grape juice from fermenting at all, creating a non-alcoholic communion alternative for churches uncomfortable serving wine. That invention built an entirely new grape industry from scratch, one based on preventing the biological process that had made the fruit valuable in the first place. And it eventually grew into a household brand sitting in refrigerators that have nothing to do with religion at all. And the pattern shows no sign of stopping. Climate change is now shifting temperature and rainfall across traditional wine regions worldwide, forcing growers in France, Italy, and California to relocate vineyards to higher elevations and cooler latitudes their ancestors never needed. Researchers studying grape-growing regions have confirmed harvest dates across parts of Europe shifting earlier by several weeks compared to records from just a few decades ago, a change significant enough to alter the sugar and acidity balance that defines a region's signature style. Some prestigious regions may become unsuitable for their signature grape varieties within a few decades, the same kind of existential threat phylloxera once posed, just arriving in a slower, steadier form this time, 1 degree and 1 growing season at a time. Picture someone tonight, somewhere completely ordinary, pulling a bottle from a grocery store shelf or twisting a bag of grapes closed in a refrigerator drawer. Nothing about that moment looks historic. There is no fanfare, no sense of empire or crisis attached to it at all. But underneath that casual gesture sits 8,000 years of religious ritual, imperial conquest, monastery survival, colonial expansion, near total ecological collapse, and a hidden graft running through nearly every vine on the planet. An entire civilization built invisibly into something people reach for without a second thought. Somewhere in your own kitchen tonight, there is probably a food or drink sitting exactly like that grape once did, ordinary on the surface, completely invisible in its history, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about where it actually came from. Grapes were never just fruit. They were currency, religion, empire, and near extinction, all hiding inside something people swallow without a second thought. That raises an obvious question about everything else in your fridge right now. Comment one food you'd want uncovered like this next, and then click the video already waiting on your screen, because it traces a hidden empire even stranger than this one, built entirely around a plant almost nobody suspects.